Starting. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Symbiosis Weekend. And right now, we're really excited to hear from Annabel. She's going to talk to us about her technique, how she uses the Kozo scroll to collage. So, Annabel, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Dorothy. And thanks everyone for being here this morning. I'm a little less nervous than yesterday, which is good. It's good for me. Hopefully I'll come clear enough. So I wanted to explore something new and be able to share it and in all truth. And right towards the end of it, I thought it had been a failure, and I just stepped back and said, okay, that's what the lesson's going to be. This does not work. But fortunately, it wasn't. So here we go. So we're going to talk about Collage Kozo scrolls. And this happened because I committed to an exhibit that will happen in the next 2 weeks. And they wanted one of the panels in the book from the presentation yesterday. And then as I was out of town, I had submitted my work to another exhibit and they wanted the whole thing. So I said, oh, shoot, now I need 2 books for both exhibits because the rest of the panels needed the central book based on my presentation yesterday. So I didn't want to repeat a book because that was, what fun is that? So I wanted to do something similar that could still be cohesive with one of the panels. So I said, okay, let me try to make a scroll out of similar content so that it could live next to the panel behind it. And let's see if this works. And I needed a topic to present to you guys, which was really troublesome for me because I've never taught calligraphy. So, and this is not a teaching in calligraphy anyway, but okay, this is working. So this is based on techniques that I learned from 2 of Brody's classes. One was a collage class in which we use large wooden panels to tape to stretch. In his case, we used reed paper and rice paper, and there were thick, heavy collages. And the Kozo, in which we stretch the Kozo in big wood stretchers, and it's a very different technique, but I really wanted to see how they overlapped. And something I mentioned yesterday as well was I wanted to combine those techniques with a tie-dye principle, which I had learned from Kasia Clark. It's an online class, and she uses, it's sort of like a resist tie-dye technique on a wet strength tissue paper. So as I said, it was my intention to make a second version of the Book of Hours from yesterday's project, making a scroll. It was easier because I had the content. I already knew what I wanted to say and what needed to be included in the scroll. So this is a view of the scroll and a partial view of the scroll. And I'm going to start from the beginning. This is me stretching a piece of Kozo sheet. And somebody has asking what Kozo is, and Kozo is it's actually made of mulberry, and I use several kinds, and it is not a linear process. It needs for it to have the transparency that I want, or the porosity, I should say. It needs to be thin enough to let the paint bleed through. So I actually found this Korean mulberry paper that's available on Amazon, which has more texture than the Kozo we were using, but I'm going to show you both. And it's free shipping for the US. So this is what I buy, which is called Hanji, unbleached, non-whitening, acid-free Chan Yohi fibers. And you can see in the picture here, you can see the fibers of the paper. So this is available through Amazon. It is, it's pricey. I think it's but the other Kozos as well is about $100 for 10 meters. But it lasts several paintings. And then this is the Kozo that we use for Brody's class, which is from Awagami Papers, which is a factory in Japan, and they're amazing. But you do have to be careful because we first purchased the too thick a Kozo and the paint wouldn't come through. So it wasn't doing what we wanted it to do in the process. So it's 42 GSM. They call it thick white, but they have a 70 and that was too thick. So the 42 grams is the one that ended up working. And it is also expensive. It comes from Japan. So for people in the US, it's the shipping cost. It's actually, here it says $56, but then there was a surcharge because they were too long. So I think I had to pay another $50. So, but I nonetheless have purchased it several times, and I've also purchased from them this Ogura lace paper, which is gorgeous. And I'll show you part of how I've used it. It has big holes in it, so it has really a very defined textured. So I'm going to jump from the Kozo to the wet strength collage. And this is my setup. It's the same table in the middle of my studio, which is always a mess. And I use an old shower curtain to cover my table because it is messy and I don't want drippings in the books below it. And this is the Cassia Clark class, and I
Okay,
bought
wait. Sorry, I need to
Yeah.
stop you. Are you sharing your screen, Annabelle?
Oh my gosh, am I not?
I don't know. A few people are saying they cannot see the
I can see her screen.
Oh, you
I can see it.
Yeah, I
Okay.
I can see it.
Okay, okay.
I can
So
see it too.
all right. So maybe those who are not seeing it, you adjust your view, go to view and then side by side speaker.
Want me to try sharing again?
No. It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, I'm also seeing it. So it should be, yeah, most of us are seeing it. Sorry,
I
please carry on.
think it's a new feature. Zoom had an update. If you look at the upper left corner, there are two blocks, meeting and screen share, and you have to click on screen share to see what she's sharing. Otherwise, you will just see Annabelle talking.
My screen? Is it me or Dorothy has to do
No,
this?
for you, it's perfect. You're doing everything perfectly
Yeah.
fine.
Thank you.
It's not you, Annabelle. Don't worry. It's whoever is viewing, you need to go to the setting that Sabina was saying, and then click on the screen share so you can see what she's sharing. Okay, Annabelle, please carry on.
Okay. So anyway, this is me prepping my table for this somewhat messy process. And what we need is the wet strength carnival paper, the wet strength tissue paper. This is the brand Cassia Clark recommended. I have a shower curtain covering the table. And then some pigment to use to staining the paper. And she recommends very diluted acrylic inks. And I experimented also with Bister inks and different pigments mixed with matte medium. And you have to be careful because the matte medium will make it adhere. And it's sort of a balance. You want the pigment to adhere, but you don't want the paper to adhere to itself. And this is also this is the carnival papers. It's available through Amazon in the US, and it is pricey. It's about $1 a sheet. for something for a tissue paper, but it's a lot of fun to work with. And then you need water sprayer and these piece of polycarbonate plastic and a piece of glass. And that's what I use. You could do that, or you can use a trash bag to stretch the paper on. And then this is me taking out my collage papers. And that's the size of a sheet. And it's sort of like doing tie-dye clothing is you wet the paper and wrinkle it in different patterns to create these weird textures or these weird marks in the paper. So this is, and it needs to be really wet. Here I'm, you know, spraying and spraying and spraying some more. Now it's pretty much surrendered other than that edge. And then you wrinkle it. And how you wrinkle it is what's going to make the paint or the pigment settle differently on paper. And I usually roll it to the size of, you know, my polycarbonate, my plastic piece. And in this one, I used Bister ink that was green and yellow. It's a combination of green and yellow. The Bister inks are pigments that I think were originally intended for wood staining, and they're very warm. They're like walnut inks. So even though they're colors, they're very earthy colors. And you will see this is the green and the yellow, and it looks like a brownish olive when it's done. And this is me applying the paint to, or the ink, the Bister inks to the paper. And the amount of water, again, will determine, that's just something you experiment with. And this is saturated with paint and water. And then that's the hardest part of the project, is waiting overnight for it to dry. And that's the same with the Kozo. Every layer of thing you do, you have to just sit and wait and do something else because it's just not going to dry quickly enough. So this is me putting it away until the next morning. And this is me the next morning trying to peel it. And you can see it's starting to rip. So what I used was a pre-mixed pigment that I had for the Kozo work, not necessarily for the collage paper. So it had too much matte medium. So I said, okay, let me just keep trying slowly and see what's happening. And I'm peeling whenever there's air underneath the paper. I'm trying to peel whatever is happening. I mean, it's letting me come. And you can see there's rips in the paper everywhere. So depending on what you want the paper for, you may need to be more careful than I am. And at some point, the paper was just so stuck that I said, okay, this is not working. So I sprayed it again with water. And fortunately, the ink stayed and the pattern stayed from the previous staining, but it was able to come off my board. And you can see there, you know, it's not a perfect piece of paper, but it's a pretty interesting piece of paper. And this is the holes in the paper, as you see, the white spots. That's me letting it dry again a little bit because now I had re-wet it and I didn't want it to re-stick. And then these are other papers that I had done from before, and I had stretched them on plastic bags, some trash bags. And that allows me to make them a little bigger, less pattern, and I can make more of them at a time. As I said, the drying process is the hardest part. And then this is using different color combinations. And I have a million of them at this point, because I honestly never know what I'm going to use them for. And then another technique I do with this tissue paper is I tape them. I cut the sheet of tissue to the size of a sheet of paper. This is an A3 11 by 17. And I use very thin strips of tape on the edges so I can maximize the surface. And I run it through my copy machine. And this allows for a huge plethora of exploration. It's thin enough, you can see the shape, my finger coming through the paper. And I'll show you examples of some of this work. This was, I think, a color copy. And you have to be careful because I tried it last year with a different kind of ink and the black would smear with reds. So some inks are not wonderful for this, but I'm buying now the brand inks and it seems to work really well with color and black and white and black ink. So these are all experimental things. So, and then you can see my hand through the paper. This is the brownish ink, and that's the paper, the white paper itself. That's the black ink on the paper. And then another thing I do afterwards, these were sketches from one of my architecture books. And I printed the wet strength paper, and then I stained it afterwards. So you can do it in reverse order as well. You can have a print that you like and stain it a color if that's what's going to serve your purpose. And this I did not use on the scroll, but I wanted to point it out because I could have. And then these are examples that I had done for the project from yesterday, the overall project and panels. And these are old letters that I had and that I sort of stuck on the paper. And what's wonderful about it is you wet the paper and it adheres to whatever background you're using it. Wanting it on, and you can just take it off here. You can see in the bottom right, it's the Kozo paper that's wrinkled from the wetness of where I had placed the letters before. So it's easy to compose with because you're just sticking them with water and playing around and placing them in different positions until you find what you wanted to do. And then that's the same thing. You can see how dark it's here. It's wet. It's a paper, it's wet. This is before I glue them permanently on the Kozo. I was just testing the placement. And this is testing the transparency, that depending on how much pigment is on your tie-dyeing, it would allow seeing things to be seen through more or not, but it also creates more depth in the layering, which I think it's really interesting. And this is what the sketches on white paper look like. The paper, once it's glued, doesn't disappear completely. It depends on what the background is. So there's this dialogue between the back and the front. And in this case, was Kozo paper. This was a tie-dye paper. And this was another wet strength paper. It wasn't tie-dyed, it was just white over the three of them. And you can sort of see the layers. And in this case, you see it less. It was a lighter background and the paper disappears almost completely, which I find a wonderful technique because you can have these layers sort of come from nowhere. And in this case, these were old letters between my mother and my grandfather in the 60s when they were. And that's another, here you have the tie-dye paper. That was a footprint on Kozo and the letters. And I'm really backtracking to yesterday's presentation a little bit just to show the possibilities of this system. So for the Kozo painting, once you find the right paper that you like, you're gonna need, we use oil-based paints and we use latex paint as well to use as resist. So now I'm going back to the Kozo part, not the wet strength part. And in Europe, the idea with using the oil-based paint is that the oil sort of bleeds and creates this halo, which I think is wonderful. And for some reason, Europeans get a lot better halo than Americans do. I don't know if it's the regulations with the paints or the kind of thinners they're allowed to use or what it is, but their halos were a lot nicer than ours. So I've been experimenting with a plethora of oil-based paints, and I found that the best halos come from these tiny little guys, which are tester paints, and they're teeny. They're the size of a nail polish. And they're pretty pricey, so I just have to wait till they go on sale so I can buy several of them, and then you dilute it a lot to create the halos. And this is White Spirits, and this is my soft brush that I love, and it's from a company called Cheap Joe's, and it's just incredibly soft. And I like it for the pigmentation in the back. So this now is working on the scroll. This was the stretch piece of Kozo that I showed you at the beginning. And this is writing. The white writing is in the back. It's the first layer of Kozo, and I do it with the board laying down on the table. And it's with oil-based paint. If you look closely, you can sort of see the halos in there. And the halos are really not visible until you paint the back of it. And then it starts repelling the pigment, and that's when it becomes really interesting. And then, as I said, it was the same theme as the scroll. I mean, as the book, from the Book of Hours. So I knew the images I wanted to have in the scroll. There's my birds, there's the feathers, there's the Oreo, the Galician building. Here is a copy of the map of my DNA. And this is written, it's one of the poems from my Cuban side. One side is the Spain side, one side is the Cuban side of my DNA. And this, again, refers back to yesterday's presentation. It's a book on who I am. It's a book of hours about my past. And these are culturally the two main elements of it. And these are the wet tissue papers with photocopies on them. These are color copies, some are black and whites. And I'll show you a copy which is with the lace paint, with the lace paper from Awagami. So this is me laying out the arrangement of how I think one's going to be the front side, one's going to be the back side of the scroll. And this is a closer view. This is just overlaying the papers, seeing what's going to work and what's not going to work. Nothing seems to have been glued yet. And this is how I paint the Kozo. Once I do the writing on the flat surface, then I put it on this little table. It's called a workbench. And it's not a pricey item, but it's two boards that hold the Kozo, the frame together. And then you can paint front and back. And you can see how tight my space is. I just have this little hallway in front of my desk. And I just stand it there and then push the thing forward, paint in the back, and then wait for it to dry and see what the color's doing to the front of the panel. So this is, I'm considering the front, and the back you're not seeing here. So I'm painting the pigment, the writing happened on the front, the pigment happens on the back. You could put pigment in the front as well, and it would just color the white paint. And this is placed horizontally again. And you can see here the halos. This is what we call the halos, these sort of blurring of the image that allows the paint to create a separate edge. And I'm just totally enamored with those. That's sort of the most fascinating thing for me. And then this is committing to, okay, I've painted the background, I know what I want to say, and I'm just committing to start collaging things on it. This is the lace paper from Awagami. You can see how textured it is, and there's holes on it. And what I did is the same process that I just made a color copy. I mean, a copy on the copy machine of the altered images on that paper, and it's just really much more textured than the tissue paper itself. And you just adhere it with matte medium. So I use my polycarbonate thing, I put this reverse side up. Once I figure out where it's going to go, you paint it with the medium and then you glue it on the page. And on you go, and I have marks because I know this has to flip and it has to be much more linear than I would a normal Kozo piece. I use the chalk pencil and the straight edge and try to keep this as straight as possible, which is really difficult for me. And this is a close-up of it overlapping. You can see how transparent it is. You can see the paint underneath. You can see the writing underneath. And this is 2 different layers of the wet tissue paper, one with a color copy and one with a black and white. And here is another view of it. And I find it really beautiful how these things, and you can see here the halos behind the white paint as well. Oops, sorry. And this is the thing finished with the collage on it. So now I'm evaluating what needs to happen and where more writing is going to happen. And this is sitting on this. And this is doing another layer of writing. And what you here is this is very thin paper floating on air because you have it stretched on a frame. So you need to put something underneath to fill up this air gap between it so you don't rip through the paper. And because I know I'm going to be wetting it and putting matte medium on it, actually, before I do that, I do a very thin layer of matte medium before I start writing. So I know that the paint, because I'm writing over several surfaces that are different. So I don't want the ink to bleed through the paper. So I just sort of prime it slightly with very wet matte medium. And here I'm using India ink so that it can withstand further wetting. And I'm just trying to bring moments from the other book into the scroll. And that's the overall. So I'm working on it. And this is already, I mounted the Kozo structure and I split it in half. So now I'm ready to mount the scroll onto itself. So now I'm getting nervous because I don't know what's happening here. And to do this, I go outside where I have a glass table that I can stretch this on. And you put the paper, the front of the paper, upside down so that it adheres to the table, to the glass table. And you can start seeing here how the papers are starting to wrinkle differently. And this is where it became exciting to me, because I really had no clue what was going to happen. So this is one side of the Kozo. This is the other side. So once the paper is moist, you need to let it relax. All these papers need to sort of calm down. And you brush the wrinkles out. And you can see the mess it looks like. You can see the tensile strengths of the wrinkling every which way. And for this, I went back to Brody's class and I used to, now I have to tape sandwich one paper onto the other. So while I cut them, one is slightly smaller than the other, so that when I mount it behind it, it will adhere to the table. So I use the rice starch, and I use the PBA glue, because it's just not one consistency of paper. So the rice starch, I don't know that it will adhere evenly. And then this is really laborious for me because it's you have to brush all the wrinkles out. There's air gaps between them. There's wrinkles from the tensile strength. So it really looks a mess. And this brushing of the wrinkles takes forever. And you keep brushing the wrinkles out. And this is what it looked like. And at this point, I thought the lesson was going to be, I said, okay, this did not work. And I figured, okay, it's as valuable a lesson as anything, because that looks a mess. I would never, put this in any exhibit. And I'm trying to conquer these wrinkles, the bigger wrinkles, with an X-Acto blade, trying to cut small slits into it. You see there's some air bubbles in there so that it lays flatter. And then again, this needs to dry overnight. And fortunately, it dried flat. I had to wrestle the paper out of the table. It was really adhered to the table. And you have to sort of cut with a bread knife the edges of it. But it dried flat, which was at this point surprising for me. It was a total surprise that it had worked out. And I was in such shock that I did not take a picture of this. But this is the little picture of the scroll once it was mounted. And I'm just going to show details of, and then I have a very handy husband who cuts these boards for me, and we order these finials for the ends. And I used, this is the back side. And I use this ribbon to mount it on, and I have brass nails. And I did use PVA glue under the ribbon to mount the ribbon before I nailed it. And this is the frame Mark made for me. And this is the scroll. That's the other side of, but you can see how flat it is, which is to me, it's surprising. It was like, wow, what a lucky adventure this was. And these are just sort of close-up images. You can see the textures of the different paper overlapping. This is the tie-dye paper waves. And the color prints that did not smear, my feathers. So there's different layers of prints overlapping each other. And this is details of the frame. There's a purple heart with a brass lock that he used. And this is the scroll as it sits in the corner of my room. And I had a stand that my son had built for something else that I conveniently used it for the scroll. So that's the end of this one. And then I have a very short video. Let me see if it plays on which screen there. Do you see the video starting?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so this is just me rolling the scroll. And what I like about it is you see both sides at the same time, which is one of the aims I had in the original book of hours. I wanted to be able to see both sides of me at the same time. It's the Cuban side and the Spain side as you unroll it. This is it. Oh, I can't hear you.
It's awesome. Amazing. Very, very amazing. Wow. Okay, we have a couple of questions. Natalia
Okay.
wanted to ask you, what kind of paint did you use for the large white lettering?
Oil paint.
Oil paint,
Oil
oil base.
You mentioned the oil paint, the white oil paint. And what type of oil paint? Is it
It's
the one for
those little tester tubes, the little tester paints that
test
I
tubes?
mentioned. Yeah, I
Okay.
just diluted a lot, and that's what I used so it can create the halos. You could use latex paint as well, but it will not
Okay.
have the halos. The halos just, what I like about the Kozo is that the pigments get in the paper. It goes through the paper, it doesn't sit on top of the paper. So
Mhm.
that sort of porosity, that sort of engagement of pigment and paper, I find fascinating.
Me
And
too.
sort of like toilet paper almost.
Mhm.
It's a really bad analogy, but the white big lettering is the oil base.
Okay, thank you.
Another question was about, where you had the bubbles in the paper. And then Dr. Nan says, did you have to spray to wet the paper again to brush out the wrinkles each time?
That paper, once you mount it, it's totally wet. I mean, it's wet paper, unwrinkled. That you brush it by itself, then you put the rice starch and PVA glue, so it's wet from that as well. And so it's wet on wet, and that's why it looks such a mess. And then you just keep brushing the bubbles with a dry brush at that point to try to not add any more moisture. You just want the air to sort of escape as best as it can.
Right. Great. Okay. Another question from Mark Coleman. What kind of printer did you use? Was it inkjet?
It is actually an inkjet. It's an Epson inkjet with just it's not a laser printer. It's just an inkjet printer, and I was lucky. As I said last year when I tried it, some of the blacks, we were trying to use generic inks, and the blacks were bleeding and they were turning with these red things on them that was really disruptive to the palette that I was using. So I just committed to buying their brand inks, and they've worked pretty good. I don't even let them rest or dry overnight or anything. Once I print them, I just keep working on them.
Yeah, great. Good, good. I think that's all the questions that I see. There are a lot of comments, saying congratulations, amazing, beautiful, and so on. Does anyone have questions or comments? You can unmute and talk to Annabel.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, in your experience, how much the Kozo paper can hold manipulation? Like, how many times do you think you can wet the paper, let it dry, wet the paper again, and let it dry? Because
A lot of
has a lot of
times,
fiber. Yeah.
a lot of times it's what happens with the Kozo or with the pigments I'm using is you put the pigment, and once it dries, the color fades away. So it takes many, many layers of colors. It takes at least, I would say, 6 layers of colors, depending on what you want it to do. So you keep wetting it, and when it wets, it wrinkles and it looks messy. But when it dries, it's stretched like a drum. So then you wet it again and it gets wrinkly, but the pigment just keeps being absorbed slowly. And again, I guess imagine it depends on how thin your pigments are diluted. And Brody uses much stronger pigments, and he uses this brush that he makes with a cloth, and he goes up, and just one passing is enough. But I don't do that. I'm much more timid with my pigments. I want a softer kind of gradation. And that's why I use that soft brush, and I like to create different areas. I'm composing as I'm painting. And you do need to let it dry before you know what it really looks like. So that's it. And usually what I do is, because I'm just impatient, I do like 4 Kozo pieces at the same time, because I have no patience to wait for the drying time. So it's like I'm telling 4 different stories, and I'm just, that's how I function. That's how I keep myself sane without having to wait so much. But it does take a lot of handling. However, when it is wet, it's very fragile. And when my frames are bigger than my table, many a times I've pierced through the Kozo itself. So then what you do is you put like a Kozo Band-Aid in the back of it. You use the paper paste and use a piece of Kozo, or you can express it, In Brody's case, sometimes he sews it so that you see that that was a mistake, and it becomes part of the process, those kind of haphazard moments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Coleman says, so inspiring and intimidating too, when I see all the hard work and processes that go into this. Yeah.
It is, but it's fun. It's unpredictable, and that's really what I like about it most. It's like I really don't know where I'm going to land. But I find that keeps me engaged the whole time, and I find that fascinating.
Yeah, nice. Marina, do you want to say something? Were you planning to say something? You're looking very thoughtful.
I was wondering, what are you gonna do with all this work? Where is it going? Where will people see it?
Well, I do have 2 exhibits coming up, and in next week. One is they're both in Miami, and they're during Art Basel. There's a big art festival in Miami that's called Art Basel, and there's these satellite exhibits that happen simultaneously. And I submitted an application to one, and they accepted one of the panels with the book in front. And then I had submitted an application to a second one, and I get a whole room to myself. So I'm going to be displaying the whole leftover 10 panels with the book. So that's where the book became a problem because I only had one book. And at that point, I wanted it not just flat in the stand, I wanted it open in its three-dimensional shape in the main room. And so I came up with a scroll to a piece, the first exhibit, that wanted something in front of the panel. And so it's
Yeah,
going to
that's
happen.
great because that's great because there are always many ways of doing something, specifically a book. There are,
Right.
and that is great. You have managed to create two books that have the same theme, that work on this. They work together, literally, because you used leftovers probably from your first project, and I think that's awesome. And congratulations on already having a space to show your work, because it's that's the next part of being an artist, showing your work.
And I hate having to do that. I mean,
Of
I wish it
course.
was somebody else sitting in front of the work and not me having to stand there.
Of course, but
But it is exciting. I see it. It's an opportunity. It's totally
Yeah.
pushing me out of my comfort zone again. But that'll be my panic for next year, the next week. For now, I'm happy these two presentations are over.
yeah, yes, it's all these are all exercises for a bigger
Yeah,
theater.
exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Marina.
Thank you. Sandra says your art is something completely new and impressive to her. A new door to the incredible world of art. Thank you, Annabelle. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
it's true. That's great. It's wonderful to see your processes. Yeah, that's great. Well, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you, Annabelle, for sharing your process.
And Dorothy, if you haven't looked at the chat at all, if you can share that with me, I
I
would
will.
really appreciate it.
Definitely, yes, for sure.
Thank you guys for supporting me and for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Annabelle.
Thank you, Annabelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. That was great. Well done.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording now. So.
Okay.